Okay, so I want to talk about talking the talk. So this is about our claims for representing dialogue in museums and how complicated that can be. But on the other hand, I don't at all want anybody to be put off doing it, because for me, it is the central point of what a museum's role is all about. Okay, so I'd like to thank you for inviting me to speak today. It's very kind of you to ask me to speak about dialogue in museums. But you see, I have a problem with dialogue. I'm interested in the ethics of dialogue in museums, but I have a series of questions. What's the nature of the dialogue? What values and or prejudices underpin it? What's the offer? And who is it actually for? Is it for the museum? Is it for the person that you're talking to with? How much does it appropriate people's personal stories? And to what end? Who sets the context? Who sets the agenda? Who edits the account? How much is permission understood or freely given? How controlled is the dialogue? Does it allow for disagreement? Very, very important. And who makes these decisions? Where are the decisions made? By the way, if you want, I'll make this available, the slideshow, so you don't have to write down everything. It's too much to write down. And what's beyond the talk? Does it lead to action? Is there something beyond the talk? So these are some of my questions about dialogue. And what other models are there out there? Are there other models? So that's a lot. We could have an entire conference just on these questions. And my most important thing, and often when I have a meeting with museum people, I put empty chairs in the room. Because my question is, who's not part of this conversation? Who are we talking? Who's left out of the decisions we're making on behalf of people? So who's not involved in these decisions? Okay, so who sets the terms? Who decides? But the thing is, and this is going to sound very peculiar, I also have a problem with kindness. Big problem with kindness. And this is a great thing about getting older. You get to be cranky, and you can say things like, I have a problem with everything. But I will focus most of my talk today on dialogue, on my difficulty with unchallenged notions of dialogue in museums, as if dialogue alone is the answer. But what is the question it's asking? Or answering. And I want to go back, and for those of you who know museum studies, there's a very key moment in museums, and it was around the notion of the contact zone. So the museum as a contact zone really came out of, most influentially, somebody called James Clifford from the University of Berkeley in California, anthropologist. And his key issue was working with First Nations in the northwest of North America, and coming up with this notion that he borrowed from others, that the museum is a place where people come together and discuss and have contact through objects. But one of the things I always like to remind people, when Clifford talked about the contact zone way back then, he said it's an ongoing historical, political, and moral relationship, a power-charged set of exchanges of push and pull. And one of the things I have difficulty with, and I felt was somehow left out sometimes yesterday in the conversation about dialogue, is the notion of institutional power and how power works in the relationships when you invite people into your space. So how does this work? And how conscious we need to be that there's this push and pull and power is in operation within these relations. So there are others who have said, again, another anthropologist, no matter how much museums have argued for this pluralistic approach, the intellectual control has largely remained in the hands of the museum. Exercising voice, and this is where I borrow from international development studies, because for me it was one of the most interesting areas to look at how participation is critiqued in the way it works around the world. critical development studies is a very interesting area to look to in terms of the literature, because they have generations past been critiquing the whole notion of public participation and public empowerment and citizen empowerment much longer than we have in museums, but they're very similar areas that we're looking at. This is Andrea Cornwall, who is also working in that area in international development, and she's talking about it's more than just inviting people to sit at your table. So to say we have now got a dialogue because we've invited you to sit at our table in our institution is to disregard all the other subtle ways that there is closure in terms of and shutting down what people bring to that conversation and intellectual control of it. And that isn't to say you don't do it, it's to say these are the things we have to be aware of. We have to look at how do we disentangle these issues. So for me, before I discuss and critique what happened in my own practice in setting up the museum as contact zone, and for me this is hugely important, that we look and critique our own practice all the time as we learn what we do, and do it openly. Before I do that and talk about one particular experience that I learned a lot about, for good or ill, I want to return to the issue of, that leads such work, or underlies such work, the museum's mission and values, and the whole notion for me. So, the values, the prejudices potentially that underpin the work that we're doing. And I do a lot of work, and I'll do some work this afternoon in the workshop about how do we discover the values we bring to this kind of work. What is it that we're trying to uncover? And how do we get to understand that more clearly? So what I want to go back to in this whole issue of values is the notion of charitable kindness and the anthropological concept of the gift. Very, very useful here. A lot of this work in museums have been influenced by a notion of humanitarianism, absolutely, perfectly a good, laudable motivation. However, there is a sting in the tail of working in this way, because what it does is place people forever in the position of being on the receiving end of the gift, which, while we are saying we want to empower them, we are also disempowering them by putting them in a position in relation to the institution. So what I'm talking about here is how do we disentangle this and become more conscious and ethically conscious of our practice. And keeping in mind all the time the issue of personal dignity. How do people maintain their personal dignity and they're not undermined? But that with the best will in the world, we can undermine people's dignity. So let me just show you, for example, I've used this lots. This is just language from a museum's mission statement. But it's like many others. And it looks, from first glance, it looks fine, right? It looks like a good thing, you know? We believe we have a responsibility, we have a strong sense, we can make people's lives better, but we are generators of well-being, we play a leading role, we increase racial tolerance, we nurture a sense of belonging, cohesion, identity, and pride. And we provide, develop, expand, foster, ensure, target, encourage, promote, pursue, enhance, articulate, and tell. Now, who has the active agency here? The institution. It isn't that this is a bad thing, but how do you enable people when you have all the active agency and they are now always in a client relationship to the institution in this regard? And I was really moved with your presentation yesterday because I think a lot of First Nations organizations have really taken this on board in terms of empowerment. How do we empower ourselves? That's a kind of decolonization of practice, very, very clearly. So, so you see, we have a problem with empathy and tolerance in the museum because of the position. And you know, Gramsci always talks about it's a war of position. we always have to be conscious of the positioning of ourselves in relation to other people. And this gift of engagement and participation can too easily, and I always love this concept because I think it's really key, it creates indebtedness engineering. It's so people are now indebted to you. How can they critique you? How can they challenge you when they're now indebted to you for what you're doing for them? What kind of relationship? Is there anything equitable in that relationship? If we are saying we want to create equitable relationships, how does that work? Okay. So I'm going to give you a little quote from, it's in some of my writing, but I love it so much I'm going to indulge myself again. It's a book by this writer, Neruda, Nerudan Farah, and he's Somali. He's being put up for the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he should be, but he's a wonderful writer. And this book is called Gifts. And in it, there's a character, Basaso, who says, Basaso is a taxi driver, and he says to Danaya, who is a nurse walking along the road in Mogadishu, and he says to her, "Why don't you come with me? I'll give you a lift in my taxi." And she says, "Why?" I'm curious to know what his answer would be. And he said, "I'll give you a lift, and then I'll reward you with further gifts." And she said, "But I haven't asked you to do me a favor, or give me a lift, or reward me with presents, have I?" And he said, "But you're a fool if you don't." She said, "Let me be." And she said it in a hostile voice. But later, she finally accepts a lift. He asks her every day, "Why do you give me these lifts, Basasu? Please tell the truth," she said. And he said, "Well, why do you accept?" And he said, "That's a foolish question, since your giving precedes my acceptance or rejection. My accepting your gift of a lift is itself a reciprocal gift. So may I now ask why you accept my gift?" And she says, "Why are you hesitant about receiving things from others?" And this is the key bit. She said, "Because unasked for generosity has a way of making one feel obliged, trapped in a labyrinth of dependence. Haven't we in the third world lost our self-reliance and pride because of the so-called aid we unquestioningly receive from the so-called first world? So now we in the West are trying to decolonize practice, and we talk about this in our exhibitions, but nonetheless we replicate relationships that are often infused with these kind of gift-giving, undermining, and quite colonialist relations within the museum. In my practice, I have been very much challenged by others from other parts of the world for exactly this, who have said, "What are you asking? Are you saying we're friends? What are we? You know, who are you in relation to me?" So this is my project, Collective Conversations. And I say this is a project that I began, it must be 15 years ago at least. It was probably, without sounding arrogant, a little before its time. It was in the Manchester Museum at the University of Manchester, where I was the deputy director. And the concept was very much contact zone. We'll create a space where people will talk to one another through collections, and we will reach marginalized people, and we worked with a lot of refugees, because Manchester is full of refugees, there are a lot. And I was interested in the whole notion of solidarity, ethics, shared, embodied, lived experience. I was very moved by the fact that lots of refugees flee with objects from somewhere, and they talk through objects themselves, and how could we transpose that into the museum. So far, so good. And then, and that we would, through museum collections, have access to each other. And if anybody is interested in the theory behind this, it was very much Levinas, Merleau-Ponty, the whole notion that you would know another through proximity with another, and that we would just we would reach across through collections. To know yourself means to be, yeah. So it was very nice concept. And it worked for a long time. In fact, we won Europe-wide awards, we won awards nationally, and I was very uncomfortable with this practice. So these are, and we, not only that, we asked permission to videotape the conversations that came up about the collections. So in some ways they were quite formalized because there were conversations between people and curators. And these are clips from the videos. These videos are still available on YouTube. And these are some of the contact zone images from the contact zone practice. And it absolutely meant direct access to collections, and in many cases touch. We were really pushing for this. Collections, access to stores. I think there are issues here, and I just refer you to this because I don't have time to go into it. The issue of copyright and people being filmed, and there is a whole lot of work done by these individuals on this. And I think it's very important to take note of this, because there are absolutely issues about representing people's personal stories into a much broader audience, as we saw yesterday, which came up. Okay, so this, I never quote myself, but I'm going to, because I was interviewed for the ethical collections, for that piece of work that was done by other academics. And this was what I was saying back then, this was what made me uneasy. And now we're collecting people. We're representing their lives. We're now collecting all their stories. Some of them their most intimate lives. And I became more and more uncomfortable with it. People were not involved with editing the final product. So how is it that we get to do something with these stories? It's the idea is we've signed a document, now it's ours, that's it, you're done. And I really started to wonder what's the value here in what we're doing. And this, again, Robert Boast, who says, are they really sites of reciprocity, these situations? They're possibly sites of appropriation, because they are another form of collecting people's lives now. They remain sites where the others come to perform for us, not necessarily with us. So what became very interesting to me was when we turned the camera off and stopped having these formalized museum set, and we'd have a conversation with people, all kinds of other things came up. And a lot of times, a lot of anger came up. But anger that was to do with their representation in the institution, about their own lives, about any number of things. And the other point here, as has been pointed out by, and if you haven't read it, it is an absolutely primary work, Linda Chuhua-Smith, who is Maori, about decolonizing methodologies. Some knowledges are actively in competition with each other. So sometimes people are coming to the museum because the stories they want to tell are a form of resistance. But we now put them into another category, and we own them, and we take the resistance out of them. We take the passion out of them. We take the anger out of them, and we package them within the museum. So, the act of allowing a source community continues to silence the stories of violence and degradation that was the colonial past. So, as we heard yesterday, there are many stories that and for my own practice, I came out of working with First Nations for many, many years in Canada. So I learned a lot of this firsthand, because First Nations in Canada are very organized in relation to museums and really challenge museums in terms of this kind of practice. And the other issues, as a colleague from Palestine says, the museum cannot be outside of political issues. The past is contested territory. So if you come in and try and package it in a way that takes out the contest, then what service are we providing? It won't necessarily, the past won't disappear if it's ignored. Yeah. So this work continued for me with the museum working on collective conversations, but increasingly uneasily. And meanwhile, we're winning awards. And I'm saying, yes, but I don't like this practice. I'm really uncomfortable with this practice. And then we decided we were going to co-produce an exhibition. And the exhibition was on the subject of race, because we live in a hugely diverse city, Manchester. And right outside, the museum is based, a large museum in the university, surrounded by the most diverse communities in Manchester. So race and racism were huge issues, and racial violence was is still a huge issue. So we decided to do an exhibition about the museum's scientific racism in the museum. So we were talking about the past, and we decided to work collaboratively and co-produce the exhibition. And we sat and we had many meetings, and we consulted and we collaborated and we co-produced. However, and I've written a great deal about this, there's a paper of mine called Legacies of Prejudice. We then analyzed what happened, because in the process of putting together that exhibition, we kept notes of everything, every single meeting, and we noticed, and I chaired these meetings, we were shutting down conflict. We were finding a way of smoothing it over and saying, yes, I hear your pain, nodding, I understand, but now we're moving on to the next item on the agenda. And so what happened, what we were actually shutting down, was not the history. We were absolutely open. We wanted to talk about historic racism, but we were unwilling to talk about contemporary racism and how racism reenacted itself institutionally through the museum. So the our collaborators were challenging us all the time, and it's in the notes of the meetings, and we were institutionally fairly blind to the fact that we were saying, well, they're just upset, we need to move on. And in fact, what happened was, of course, this is what happens. I'm not saying we're the only ones. I have seen many, many examples of this in other museums, is that there's a general dissatisfaction. And this is the reaction. We're going to represent you, we're going to do this for you, we're going to represent your identity, and it's good for you, I don't care. This has nothing to do with my life. Because the experience of participating with the museum, and this is the problem, can raise more anger because of that institutional blindness, the what is actually. Somebody said to us, I want to talk about racism. I don't want to talk about it as an abstract academic concept. I want to talk about it how I feel it in my life, how I feel it every day, how I feel it in my body. I want to be able to talk about that here and now. So we held, we were a museum who prided itself on being very liberal and forward-looking. One of our collaborators said the museum is racist. So and that all museums are racist. So we held a public debate. It was packed. I mean, half of Manchester seemed to come to that public debate. That debate changed my entire practice. That debate was where the lid came off of the anger about the museum containing. Because remember, museums have always had a civilizing mission, often for the state, on behalf of the state, and have still feel that. In fact, museums now all across Europe work with migrant populations as a way of creating social cohesion. That isn't necessarily the same thing as allowing people to have a voice. Social cohesion creates this situation where you're trying to dampen down any kind of difference. So if that is your motivating factor, then isn't this contradictory when we're saying we're places of democratic dialogue? How does this work? So we were challenged absolutely. And Arundhati Roy talks about this. Their real contribution, institutions like museums, is that they diffuse political anger and dole out as aid or benevolence what people ought to have as a right. Do they have a right to have a voice? So are we institutions that are about public rights? People right to voice. They're publicly funded institutions. I mean, in Britain, they're almost all publicly funded institutions. So do people have a right to speak? So here, one of the people at that debate, Are Museums Racist, said, we're here to challenge. And I fear that you're not going to challenge us back. You're going to nod and say, yes, I hear your pain. I hear your anger. But position ourselves so we're not engaged, as though we have a completely separate but somehow overseeing role. I want to be disagreed with. I want to have the opportunity to have dialogue and debate. So a lot of my work is known for this document. It's called in the UK a lot the Cape Report. And I was asked to look at this kind of practice across the UK. After decades of investment in public engagement and participation, I was asked to look at how effective has it been. So my entire purpose then was, I'm not just going to ask the institutions, obviously. I'm going to put in the same room the institutions, and we're going to fill those empty chairs. We're going to ask the people who have been on the receiving end of working with the museums. And they may be partner organizations, it could be whatever, who really knew each one of these 12 institutions. Well, just putting them in the same room was fantastically interesting, because the perceptions were so entirely different. They were absolutely different. So if I asked people to stand on a spectrum of it really worked, it really didn't work, then we had the museum director at the far end of the room saying, fantastic, really worked, our public engagement, or the marketing manager, fantastic, really worked. And then we had people down here saying, it didn't work for me. In fact, I'm never going to do it again, So it became hugely, and it was way more than I understood. So what they were talking about was this notion of false consensus. So there's an assumption of consensus when you say, we've all agreed, now we're going to do this, right? And then, but have we actually taken into account that other people may have other points of view? Have we allowed any space for people to have other points of view? False promises. I always like this English. There's a promise of something that never materializes, and the outcome is empowerment light. There is the empowerment isn't real. There are claims made, but the empowerment isn't real. And for me, this became all about this notion of looking at people as the beneficiary rather than the active agent. So even if you switch between these two pictures, which are exactly the same, and you look at people as a beneficiary or an active agent, it changes your perception, So for me, this became hugely important. And I think because so much of my work, and now so much of my work around Europe, is around especially the migrant so-called crisis, is that the notion of treating people only as victims puts them in an even more undermining and disabling position. So they can't escape their victimization. Now they have no voice. They're simply on the receiving end of our charitable efforts. And there is a soft bigotry, even though we pride ourselves in being so, generous and inclusive. I mean, social inclusion itself is some pretty interesting language when you think about it. It's including you in my party, in my effort, including you in this place, but this is my place. I'm inviting you in. So there is a kind of invisible hand of prejudice in museums. I say this with great love and affection for museums, and I know the potential museums have, because I also know the museums that are breaking this mold. So, but they're doing it because they're doing it consciously. They're consciously seeing how this works. So one of the other things is the shift towards this notion of rights, that there's a rights-based museum practice. you know, and a lot of what's coming through here in the Museums Association is based on this notion that people have rights, and they have rights to use their public institutions and to have a voice in their public institutions. And that in fact, at a time like this, when virtually everything else has disappeared, from trade unions to churches to places where people congregate, museums may be one of the last sites for democratic engagement. So we have to, there are so many things, so maybe I won't go into this too much, but mainly the notion is museums are partners. They're not saviors. We're not here to save people. If we're saving people, we're positioning ourselves in relation to them. So I can give you many examples. So, I mean, I feel like Francoise, I have too many stories in my head. I want to tell you stories. If some years back, I was asked to go to a Northern European museum that was very progressive, new institution, and it had invited a large group of people who were refugees to come in and help them co-develop an exhibition. And they invited them in and gave them a position in the museum and said, we are collaborators, we'd like to treat you as fellow members of staff. And so they gave them a space to meet, and they had scheduled meetings and consultations with them. And they were doing this over a period of a year. So it was a long process. And they said, but the relationship has completely broken down. We don't know why this is working. So when I came to the museum, I was curious about how it was going on. So I asked to meet with the group, the refugee group, on their own. And it was incredibly simple. They had separate coffee rooms. When the museum staff, although they had said we are collaborators, we're co-members of staff, they drank their coffee separately. They had their conversations that were outside of the scheduled meetings, which often progressed the subject outside of their collaborators, which happens all the time. Museum staff meet and change ideas, talking to one another. But more than that, they didn't interact as friends, didn't ask about their kids, didn't talk about anything on a human level. And so they had lost trust. And trust is absolutely at the heart of all of this. So, so there's been quite a shift in museums. Museums and social activism, this is one. There's museums, they organize a Federation of Human Rights Museums. It's all about rights, rights, rights. A lot of museums have signed up to this. This was begun by David Fleming at Liverpool. And these are people at the British Museum I've done some work with, where they're exercising their rights to challenge colonial collections. And it is really around this notion, it's very much Fanon's notion of questioning. You know, how do we foster an environment where people question? Where we exercise critical pedagogy when we're working with young people, where people are encouraged to challenge, including the institution itself. That if that's what needs to be done, absolutely. And you know, that give recognition to the specific positionings of those who participate in them. So becoming human right from the outset and revealing yourself is a really big part of it. Rather than this notion of a secular religion of redemption and reparation that we are somehow involved in. And you know, at the heart of this is that antagonism, as Leclerc talks about, can't be excluded from democratic practice. Antagonism is at the heart of democratic practice. Differences, people's differences of opinion. I worked again very recently. I was asked to look at an organization in London that was working with Muslim women, and very prominent institution, museum, and it had worked with these women. They they wanted to do outreach with these women, but it included never inviting the women to the institution itself. So working off-site, fantastically. And then holding the agenda so that it was a teaching relationship. So the museum held the agenda and never asked questions of the women. And so the women took on a very passive learning role. And yet there was a day I walked in there to look at it, and the women were, I got there early, and the women were crowded around a laptop. And I realized that some of the women were on video. They had been interviewed by the BBC about radicalization of young people. And they were being asked as mothers what responsibility they had for de-radicalizing their young people. Well, these women had so many opinions. In this room, it was absolutely alive. These women were so passionate about what they had been asked. The BBC didn't give them a chance to answer the way they could have answered. As soon as the session started with the museum, they went in and assumed the passive role. Nobody was asking. Nobody asked their opinions. And a lot of times it's because there's a fear of what may come up in these situations. But why would we keep a lid on that? What are we trying to do by keeping a lid on it? Oppositional voices are not feared, degraded, or dismissed, but should be valued. And that's uncomfortable. But you know what? We have to embrace an uncomfortable practice because it's an uncomfortable world. And if we're not doing that, then how relevant can we possibly be? Yeah, this is Palestine. So embrace discomfort. This is he is a philosopher, Canadian philosopher, Jonathan Ralston Searle. He said it's the very expression of permanent discomfort. That's participation. That's the reality of it. You're not going to be comfortable. Then if you don't want to do that, don't do it. Don't make the situation worse by entering into it, offering something that's called participation, but actually isn't. I love this notion from the Palestinian Museum, a safe place for unsafe ideas. So it's a safe place where you can say what you need to say in this place. We will hold the container in a beyond sense. This container is the museum. I've published quite a bit about the practice across and other museums. I edited a book for museum management and curatorship, showing practice of people dealing with discomfort in various programs across sorry to put that back. And in recent years, I was asked to speak in Bosnia, in Sarajevo, in a society that's just come out of conflict, of course. And of course, I come from Ireland, another society that has had nothing but. And one of the things we talked about is, what role does a museum have in a post-conflict society where conflict is still very much real? Look, this is Belfast. There are, the walls have increased threefold since the peace process. So, and museums in Belfast couldn't deal with this subject, couldn't talk about this subject. Now they are trying to catch up. Now they're really rushing to catch up because they were so uncomfortable they didn't represent anybody by not being unwilling to face the reality. This is a public park, the only one in Europe that has a wall going right through the middle of it. This is Belfast. So what role for museums? In a city like that, do we turn our back from this reality? This is people's lives. And as somebody said there, people have to tell their own stories. They have to tell what is their reality. There are great, brave, again that word, practice in that city too, Belfast Exposed, where they've encouraged people over decades to photograph their own reality and now use those photographs to tell their own reality from across different beliefs and communities, working together. So You know, these are the kind of photographs they have in the archives. But this is very real in Belfast still. The past won't disappear when it's ignored. So museum co-producers, yes, sorry, this was the whole thing about the being in the museum staff in its own canteen. That's not the actual place. I'm not revealing where any of these places are. And you know, again, you know, at one point, under my pressure, they allowed the women to come into the institution. There was a full security alert. Full security. They were met by heavy-handed security, these women. This is in London today, you know? And this is a clip from one of the women speaking on the BBC, women's point of view. And you know, as somebody said at the end, one of the women said, it's not about, come, you poor women, we'll teach you things. But, you know, we have skills, we have views, we have stories. We have amazing stories of resilience to tell. I love this, Eduardo Galeano. I think this might be the quote that inspires my life's work. It's, I don't believe in charity. I believe in solidarity. And, you know, charity is vertical. It's humiliating. It goes from the top to the bottom. Solidarity is horizontal. It respects the other person, learns from the other person. And I have a lot to learn from other people. That's the humility that we need to bring to this, you know? We learn from each other. It's not, I have something to teach you. So, you know, we start to shift how we see these young people, for example, from users and choosers to makers and shapers. And the question we always have to ask ourselves at the heart of this work, it's Amartya Sen's question, the economist. He says, you know, what capability is being developed through any of this work? Whose capability? Is somebody going to get stronger through this work, you know? So, you know, and people can identify what capability they want to develop in themselves, you know? I've had women say to me, I want to be brave. I want to be brave, you know? So there's something, you know, there's something to work with. And also to think of the museum, and I feel a huge, maybe it's as I'm getting very old, it's this notion of the museum for young people, a space where learning to participate, they can cut their teeth. It's a place where they can build confidence to be able to go out. We don't own them, they're gone, you know, they work with us, and let's hope they've gained some confidence to be able to express themselves, to be able to express their views, and to transfer it to whatever other sphere there is that they can take it to. I've seen it happen. So, yeah, I'm pretty well out of time, I think. And what I have are examples of rights-based practice in other museums around the world. So I could flash through it in 5 minutes. Do you want me to do it? Have I got 5 minutes?
You have 10 minutes at least.
Loads of time. Okay. Okay, so you know, these are some of the notions now. Museums as sites of struggle, a struggle that doesn't end. It's always a struggle. It's a Carl Schmitt concept, and Chantal Mouffe talks about it a huge amount, is this notion that it's an ongoing struggle, and that we practice a radical collaboration, which is really consciously looking at what collaboration actually means. My practice is really moving into this concept. All of the practice that I see now, because I'm always asked, where's good, what's good, where do you see good practice? And I have the privilege of traveling too much and seeing a lot of museum practice. I've just written a paper about museum activism, and one of the key elements that runs through it all is where the participants become co-researchers. And I think I love that you use that, Françoise, in your notion that that's what we're doing in psychoanalysis too. It's a notion of co-researching. Well, in the same way, if you look at what do we particularly have to offer in a museum that allows people to do something active? Let's say they want to understand the past or understand their own past, or work on something that you're going to co-develop together. It's no good if the museum is the only place that has that does the research. You know, is the keeps all the research to itself. Is that noise? Is that rain?
See, there are relaxed people sitting outside in the sun, so it could not be rain.
Okay, all right.
Ghost.
A ghost, exactly. I've just seen this exhibition. It's called The Past Is Now in Birmingham Museum. What's interesting about it is that it was a very contested process of looking at the museum's colonial collections. And the participants came from various activist organizations within Birmingham, huge city of diversity. And they wanted their views represented and their questions represented in the exhibition itself. So it wasn't just about how the exhibition was assembled and what the big themes are, but what their points of view were or their challenges they wanted represented in the exhibition. So it's a nice little example of a co-produced, not avoiding the contestation. Because very often what's very frustrating is the action is often in the process, not in the outcome. The exhibition can often kill the dynamism of the exchanges. So how do you try and represent those exchanges so other people have access to them? Liverpool, this is the Slavery Museum, and Liverpool is an interesting example, and it's worth looking at it across its sites for trying to work collaboratively. I won't say too much about it, but you can see it. Hackney Museum, one of the things that's happening a lot right now, especially because people feel so disabled and about being able to make change happen in the world. There's a lot of museums looking back at past activism and looking collaboratively at past activism and saying, what was it about then and how could that be translated to now? So if you want to make change happen, how do you engage people in talking about past activism? And they've been really, really involved with that. We heard already about the Museum of Homelessness. Fantastic. One of the things they're doing is they're not worried about having a museum, an actual site yet, although they will. What they did was it was like a road trip. They went out across the country to generate the discussions and dialogue around the issues of homelessness and how we as a society respond to it. But they worked with homeless people throughout. And they have a huge, so they're very interesting. The Migration Museum in London worked with people in Calais who were refugees in Calais to co-curate an exhibition about their experience, which is called Call Me By My Name. And then Multaka, and this afternoon, if those of you are at my workshop, I'm going to use this as a case study to examine. It's in Berlin, and I've been very involved with this on and off, but it's a collaboration between refugees as guides in a series of state-run museums in the center of Berlin. And it has been a really interesting program to talk to everybody involved. I send everybody in the world to this museum. This is the Welfare Museum in Denmark. And it is a campaigning museum, but it's the most unbelievably collaborative museum. It's bricks and mortar that it collaborates and co-produces. It's a beautiful model, and I'm working on co-editing a book, and I know some people are contributing to it about this. This is one of their projects, where these are people who had been institutionalized, who are researching in the archives, this is co-researching, the history of other people who had been institutionalized in the past, and making links between their experience and the experience of that past person. They chose a person to relate to. and then developed their relationship and their dialogue about past and present. It was fantastically transformative for these, to speak to these people. This woman herself here is one of the main guides at the museum now. But it was fantastic. It is fantastically transformative. I haven't got time to go into the work that's going on there. The Battersea Arts Centre in London, it's where people are telling their own stories directly, with no mediation by the museum. Yeah, so it's so the museum gets out of the way in this regard. And then this is in Kreuzberg in Berlin. It's a very famous museum that has always been embedded in activism locally, and has run into problems with the state and everything, but has a very clear mission. And so this is a very useful book, Museums in a Troubled World, Renewal, Irrelevance, or Collapse, by Robert James. It's, it is this notion that museums cannot turn their back on the fact that we are in a very troubled world. We don't get to look at a museum in trouble in Poland and say, well, that's very sad, but it's really got nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with us. We're in this world. I mean, one of the things I often show now is the rise of the far right across Europe, and a slide. I showed it about 3 years ago, and I showed it again. It's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying. So all of these things, as somebody said, I think our colleague here said yesterday, what do? You either retreat and go back to your safe space, your comfort zone, not your contact zone, your comfort zone, and say, we're hiding, we're not dealing with it, or you do the exact opposite. You come out and you make a declaration that this is our responsibility, that we have a responsibility to be actively engaged in the conversations about this troubled world. And that is absolutely my conviction. And I think we have to get a whole lot braver and figure out how we're going to do that. Okay? Thank you.